Hello. Today we'll be looking at the punch, the movement of the punch. Generally, the punch is used to generate as much force as you can to slam your fist into somebody's face. The purpose of this video is to show how to maximize your punch by going over each of the aspects of the joints. Right side. Glenohumeral action is flexion. The agonists are the coracoid branchialis, upper pectoralis major, and anterior deltoid. The antagonists are the subscapularis, posterior deltoid, infraspinatus, subscapularis, posterior deltoid, teres major, and latimus dorsi. The plane of motion is sagittal, and the axis of motion is frontal, and the type of contraction is isometric. Scapulothoracic. The motion is upward rotation. The agonists are serratus anterior, trapezium, middle and lower. The antagonists are the pectoralis minor and rhomboid. The plane of motion is the frontal plane, and the axis of motion is sagittal. The type of contraction is isometric. The elbow, the action is flexion. The agonists are the bicep branchies, all of them, the branchialis, and the branchioradialis. The agonists are the tricep branchies, all of them, and the incus. The plane of motion is the sagittal plane, and the axis of motion is the frontal. The type of contraction is isometric. For stance, both the left side and the right side are identical.
For the right and left sides of the wrist, hand, the action that is occurring is finger flexion for the balled up fist with a neutral wrist. The muscles, the agonists, the muscles and or prime movers of the finger flexion are the flexor digitorum superficialis, the flexor digitorum profundus, the flexor pollicis longus. The antagonist muscles that oppose those agonists are the extensor digitorum, the extensor indicus, extensor digiti minimi, extensor pollicis longus, and extensor pollicis brevis. With the plane is that it occurs, that the action of finger flexion occurs about is the sagittal plane, about the frontal axis. And because of the balled up fists are held, it's considered an isometric contraction. And that same thing occurs on both left and right sides. For the radial ulnar joint, in the stance phase, occurs pronation. If you look at the body in the anatomical position, you will recognize that the radial ulnar joint is pronated and brought up into a pronated position when in the stance phase of about to punch someone. The muscles or agonists that make pronation occur in the radial ulnar joint are the pronator teres, pronator quadratus, and the brachioradialis. The antagonists are supinator, the biceps brachii, and the brachioradialis. The plane that the motion pronation occurs in is the transverse plane about the horizontal axis. This is another joint that also has isometric contraction because it's a held position. of in the stance phase, and this occurs on both right and left sides.
When in the stance phase of the punch, the knee joint is in full extension. The agonist muscles used are the rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. The antagonist muscles are the popliteus, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis and is an isometric type of contraction. The hip joint as well as the pelvis are respectively in neutral position anatomically as they have no movement. These actions are the same for both the right and left sides of the lower body joints mentioned.
For the radial ulnar joint, the same thing applies for the radial ulnar joint in the preparatory phase as the same as compared to the stance phase. The radial ulnar joint still continuously has pronation of the wrist or pronation of the forearm with about the transverse plane at a horizontal axis, and it's considered isometric because it is held. It's a held position, which makes it isometric. And moving along.
Preparatory. Right side. The glenohumeral, the action is flexion. The agonist is coracoid branchialis, anterior deltoid, upper pectoralis major. The antagonists are the subscapularis, posterior deltoid, lower pectoralis major, teres major, and latimus dorsi. The plane of motion is the sagittal. The axis of motion is the frontal. The type of contraction is concentric. The scapulothoracic, the upward rotation and elevation are the actions. The agonists are serratus anterior, trapezium upper, middle, and lower, elevatory scapulae, and rhomboid. The antagonists are the pectoralis minor, subclavius, and trapezium lower. The plane of motion is the frontal plane, and the axis of motion is the sagittal. The type of contraction is concentric. The elbow. The action is flexion. The agonists are bicep branchies, all of them, branchialis, and branchioradialis. The antagonists are the tricep branchies, all of them, and the incus. The plane of motion is sagittal, and the axis of motion is frontal. The type of contraction, concentric. For preparatory, both right and the left are the same.
When in the preparatory phase of the punch, the right knee is in slight flexion and external rotation. The agonist muscles used are the popliteus, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris. The antagonist muscles are the rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius. The popliteus for internal rotation, semitendinosus for internal rotation, and semimembranosus for internal rotation. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis for flexion, and transverse plane and longitudinal axis for rotation. It is a concentric type of contraction for flexion and eccentric type of contraction for rotation. The hip joint is in extension and abduction. The agonist muscles used are the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris, gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus, as well as the tensor fascia latae for abduction. The antagonist muscles are the sartorius, pectineus, tensor fasciae latae for flexion, rectus femoris, iliopsoas, gluteus maximus, the lower fibers, pectineus, gracilis, as well as the adductors, brevis, longus, and magnus. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis for extension, and the frontal plane and sagittal axis for abduction. They are both concentric types of contractions. The pelvic tilt and rotators are anteriorly rotating. The agonist muscles used are the quadratus lumborum, tensor fascia latae, rectus femoris, and the iliopsoas. The antagonist muscles are the rectus abdominis, external obliques, internal obliques, gluteus maximus, biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis and is a concentric type of contraction. The left knee is in extension. The agonist muscles used are the rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. The antagonist muscles are the popliteus, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis and is an isometric type of contraction. The hip joint is in flexion. The agonist muscles used are the sartorius, pectineus, tensor fasciae latae, rectus femoris, and the iliopsoas. The antagonist muscles are the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, the long head, and the gluteus maximus. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis and is an eccentric type of contraction. The pelvic tilt and rotators are anteriorly rotating. The agonist muscles are the quadratus lumborum, tensor fasciae latae, rectus femoris, and iliopsoas. The antagonist muscles are the rectus abdominis, external oblique, internal oblique, gluteus maximus, biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. It is in the sagittal plane and frontal axis and is a eccentric type of contraction.
Movement. Right side. The glenohumeral, the action is flexion and adduction. The agonists are coracoid upper pectoralis major, anterior deltoid, supraspinatus, and all of the deltoid. The antagonists are the subscapularis, posterior deltoid, lower pectoralis major, teres major, and latissimus dorsi. The plane of motion is sagittal. The axis of motion is frontal. The type of contraction for both actions are concentric. The scapulothoracic action is protraction. The agonists are the subclavius, the pectoralis minor, and the satirius anterior. The antagonists are the trapezium, lower and middle, and rhomboids. The plane of motion is the frontal plane, and the axis of motion is the sagittal. The type of contraction is eccentric. The elbow. The action for the elbow is extension. The agonists are the tricep branchies, all of them, and the incus. The antagonists are the bicep branchies, all of them, the branchialis, and the branchioradialis. The plane of motion is sagittal, and the axis of motion is frontal. The type of contraction, eccentric.